Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to those of you who may be joining us from parts out west today. Thank you for taking a little bit of time today to join us for strategies for studying mentoring relationships for attunement and cohesion. This is Mike Geringer from Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership, and we're happy to be with you today for this National Mentoring Resource Center webinar. We've got a lot of ground to cover here, so I'm going to try and do some quick housekeeping up front, and then we'll dive right into our presentations for today. So first off, I want to start off with a big thanks to OJJDP for their support of this project. And particularly for supporting the work of the Research Board of the National Mentoring Resource Center. The Research Board does a lot of things around translating research into practice, but we also do a few activities like this one where we actually want to build the skills of other researchers and teach them a little bit more kind of based on the experience of our board members on how to study mentoring programs and how to study mentoring relationships a little bit more effectively. So today, our presenters, Julia and Gabe, will be talking about a couple of kind of new ideas that I think will really help unpack what happens in mentoring relationships and can really help programs and scholars understand a little bit more what happens when two people are together in a mentoring relationship, or in the case of Gabe, when a group is being mentored together, because that gets a lot more complicated, as he will explain in just a little bit. A few housekeeping things. Obviously, we're going to keep the phones muted. We're probably going to have around 70, 80 folks joining us today. So we'll keep everyone's phones muted just to ensure a good recording here. You can still submit questions to our presenters, though, via the question panel. That should be on the little dashboard on your screen. Just go in there. You can submit a question anytime you want. And then we'll be doing some moderated Q&A about at the halfway point and then at the end of our event today. We always get this question a lot throughout the webinar is, will I get these slides? Can I get a recording of this? And the answer to those questions is yes. We will be emailing out a copy of the slides and a link to the recording to everyone who signed up for this later today. We'll also be posting all of that to the NMRC website in the days to come. So if you have colleagues of yours that you think would benefit from hearing this, feel free to pass those materials and that link on to them as well. So I want to introduce today's presenters. We'll start off with, we'll go in the order in which you'll be hearing from them today. Julia Price is professor and associate director of the Faculty Center for Ignatian Pedagogy, and I really hope I said that correctly, at Loyola University. So welcome, Julia. And Gabe Coopermink is a professor of psychology at Georgia State University and also happens to be the associate chair of the research board that I mentioned earlier for our National Mentoring Resource Center project. And then, as I said already, I'm Mike Geringer with Mentor. I'll just be facilitating today and handling the question and answer portion. So thanks to everyone for joining us today. And I think now I'm going to turn things over to Julia, and she's going to talk a little bit about the concept of attunement and why we might want to think about that when we think about mentoring relationships. So take it away, Julia. I'll skip this background for today. Take it away, Julia.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks, Mike, and for organizing, and Gabe for your collaboration, and to NMRC and OJJDP for supporting this work. It's really exciting to have the chance to share some of this developing work on behalf of my research team and hopefully have some good discussion about it. So I'll be talking about the development of the concept of attunement, some training that we've been doing in this area, and our efforts to develop a scale to help measure the construct of attunement among staff and ultimately among mentors in youth development organizations. So we'll do a quick exercise together just to illustrate a piece of what that training I just mentioned involves, and then I'll talk about the concept and evolution of attunement, the scales themselves, and the beginnings of thinking about some of the implications of attunement to practice and research today. Okay, so if it's safe for you to do so and you're not driving or otherwise requiring all of your senses, I'm going to ask for us to just pause here as a virtual community and try to kind of center ourselves in whatever way we find most useful to do so. So for me, I'm going to try to take 3 intentional breaths just to kind of slow down my body and try to regulate my nervous system. And then I'll bring us back to the group in just about 10 to 15 seconds. Okay. Thank you for indulging me in that. I know it's somewhat uncommon to have a webinar where we practice silence together. But what we're finding as we study this concept of attunement is that staff in youth development and mentoring programs often find themselves jumping in between a lot of tasks and in multiple stressful situations, sometimes at the same time. And so as we try to train staff and mentors in developing their skills in regulating themselves and reading the cues of others, one of the key components of that is teaching them some self-regulation skills, which involves self-awareness, like what am I feeling right now? Am I rushing through this contact? Do I like this mentor or not? Am I dreading this call? As a means of helping them become more attuned to themselves, and then as a result, having the skills to be able to attune to the other person they're supporting. So we found that the staff and mentors we're working with respond really well to incorporating attention to self-regulation in the trainings and in kind of the advancement of the concept of attunement. So we can move to the next slide, Mike. Thanks. So this definition of attunement, this concept came from my early work in collaboration with Tom Keller from Portland State University, where I had an opportunity actually through my dissertation to observe mentors and staff supporting youth in site-based mentoring programs. And I was able to spend a year every week watching these relationships unfold and collected a whole lot of data from that process. And inductively from the mentors and staff themselves, this construct of attunement emerged. And this construct refers to the capacity to respond flexibly to verbal and nonverbal cues by taking into account the other's needs and desires. It's a broad and teachable strategy we're finding of eliciting, reading, interpreting, and reflecting on cues. It often requires adaptation of expectations related to the relationship. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with those mentors who come in and often even staff who have a very clear sense of what they expect from the relationship and struggle to adapt those expectations based on what's happening in real time in that dynamic process. And those more attuned staff and mentors talk about really being intentional about building a relationship as a key component of their aim in their role, as opposed to like, I'm here to improve his grades, or I'm here to fix his life, or even serve as another adult in his life. Those most attuned staff and mentors would often talk first about, I'm here to get to know this child. I'm here to get to know this mentor. I want to understand what makes them tick. I want to build a connection with them. So we saw a broad range of attunement levels among mentors and staff that we had the opportunity to observe. And what we found was that those who demonstrated higher levels of attunement among the mentors were also associated with better, higher quality relationships and some of the improved youth outcomes that we're looking for in these types of programs. So when we looked at the quantitative measures that we collected related to these relationships, after inductively identifying this construct of attunement seemed to map onto these better outcomes that we were interested in. So in collaboration with Linda Gilkerson, who is a colleague from Erickson Institute here in Chicago, we have adapted her original model of attunement called the FAN, which stands for Facilitating Attuned Interactions, to the mentoring context. So I had this definition of attunement that came out of my mentoring work and encountered Linda at a conference, and she'd been doing work actually in trying to develop attunement among home visitors and other helping staff, supporting parents and young people. And I was really blown away by how her conceptualization of attunement and mine from these different settings really overlapped. And so she and I have been working together over the last 5 years to adapt her original FAN to the mentoring FAN. And this is a model that is used to train staff and mentors in essentially teaching them these skills of attunement. And I'll just be brief in providing an overview of the model here. Please don't disseminate this model without permission from me, but if you have questions or are interested in learning more, please email me directly, and I'm happy to talk with you more about it. So as you'll see on the left-hand side, the left, what we call wedge, is called calming. And that gets back to this idea I just talked about regarding the importance of centering yourself in this work in youth development. Building more attention in your practice to your own internal state, essentially. And that's really the only sort of directive within the FAN, is to try as best you can to start with or weave in some practice of calming in your work prior to a match support contact, in the middle of a difficult meeting, as much as you can in your work. The other wedges, feeling, thinking, doing, and reflecting, are not really, they're not demonstrated as a typology or a methodology, but rather as what we think of kind of as a GPS, a tracking tool that is used to essentially have this helping person, either the staff or the mentor, meet the other person where they are. So as an example, if a staff member is on a call with a mentor and the mentor is highly agitated by the fact that their mentee did not show up again for their session together, using the FAN, the staff is encouraged and trained to essentially listen to that feeling and acknowledge that feeling, and then use the cues of the mentor to move on the FAN to where the mentor wants to move. What we found actually is that staff often try to or feel they need to move to thinking or doing when a mentor is highly agitated by something. So the mentor's like, he didn't show up today and I'm just so frustrated because I put in so much time and I had to leave work. And the staff, very understandably, then says, all right, well, what should we do about this? Or let's think through how we should handle this, or I have an idea. And one of the prominent takeaways from our work with about 10 or 12 agencies now in training on this tool is that staff often find themselves almost exclusively in problem-solving roles, where they feel like they're sort of looked to solve problems. They feel like they're putting out fires and kind of trying to check off problems from their list during their day. And one of the things that they've shared with us is that this tool kind of shifts that dynamic to more of a collaborative one with the mentor, and in doing so also facilitates capacity building with the mentor, and also takes some burden off the staff. It also helps the staff feel like they are able to focus more on relationship building, which has been a really exciting insight shared with us from staff in learning this tool. So that's one example. They're in feeling, and then you kind of move with them where they go. They might be in thinking, they might be in doing, they might be in reflecting. But the idea is to use it as a tracking tool rather than trying to push someone from one wedge to the next. And just in brief, the circles in the middle kind of highlight, I think of it often as kind of the juggling act that someone's doing in any contact or relationship building experience in youth development. So they're the program expectations and staff concerns, the mentor's expectations and concerns, and the youth's preferences and needs. So a staff member is sort of managing all of those in a site visit or a match support contact or a conversation with a parent even. And what we theoretically, this attunement model is intended to build reflective capacity among all participants in the youth mentoring system, increase confidence among the staff and mentors who are trained on the tool, and then strengthen relationships across the mentoring system. So as we meet the person where they are, essentially, we experience more connection with them and vice versa. We facilitate their capacity and enable stronger relationships across the system. So I have to just bring our little friend here in just to remind us that it's not actually a typology so much as it is a tracking tool, reading and matching with the other's cues as a means of facilitating connection. Okay, so we've been able to collect some preliminary data from these trainings that we've done. And again, happy to talk about any of this in detail in the Q&A or separately. But we're seeing some exciting preliminary findings in terms of staff reporting, demonstrating a higher level of empathy and interpersonal reactivity is a dimension of empathy and self-reflective capacity between pre and post test when trained on the FAN. We've also piloted this with Mentor Together, an organization in India, and we're really excited to see an increase in empathy demonstrated by their staff or self-reported by their staff between pre and post as well. And we've had the chance to interview a large number of staff participants, and I want to just share some of the things that they've described in talking about how the tool has affected their practice, because I think it helps us kind of break open some of these ideas a little bit more. So one of the key themes is reporting a sense of being able to listen and read cues better. And one staff mentioned, I was able to grow just in terms of really attending to the mentor. I developed a real intentionality about observing their cues, asking more probing questions depending on where they're at. I came to a place where I can sort of watch them. So this is really exciting because they're kind of developing a capacity to observe what's happening in addition to engage in it. And then just thinking more about where they're at and what they're ready for before I begin to provide feedback, provide guidance, suggestions, observe where they are before I jump into those things. So those words in bold are kind of highlighting the pieces of the training related to these areas. But again, we kind of see this shift among staff where they experience themselves in more of a collaborative role and a role where they're able to facilitate the mentor's growth and where the mentor is rather than doing for the mentor. So we're also seeing some improved ability to staff to support relationships between mentors and youth. So as they develop skills in attunement, they're more able to understand where the mentor is and what the mentoring relationship is. So just working with that mentor and not giving up. There were many times where I know he wanted to give up and I wanted to terminate the match because of the frustration I was feeling because of the mentor. Meeting together, problem solving together to think of solutions, and just affirming his worth, his value in the relationship really helped change the relationship. So those are referring to what we call collaborative exploration, or the thinking wedge on the FAN and the reflecting wedge on the FAN, some skills that are embedded within those parts of the FAN training. It's really been exciting and kind of unexpected to hear staff talk about feeling more of a sense of purpose in their work when they engage in their work in this way. And we've had a chance to get some anonymous feedback from mentors who are supported by staff who've been trained on the FAN. And those mentors also refer to a sense that the strength of connection between them and the staff member post-training is stronger than prior to the staff having training. I'm involved in a collaboration here in Chicago that's a university-based mentoring program, and we've had an opportunity to train a larger group of mentors through that program, and are seeing some similarities in terms of the skills that they're developing through the mentoring FAN. So reporting essentially that they're becoming better listeners. They talk too about the FAN helping them balance curriculum content and relationship development. So realizing that sometimes they kind of like steamroll their mentee and push curriculum on them when they're feeling agitated or uncomfortable or stressed in the interaction. That's just one example. And then college student mentors using more of these calming practices during stressful interactions with mentees as a way to help regulate themselves and stay kind of present and attuned to what's happening in their relationship. As we do the training, we collect process evaluation data. So there's an initial training and then a series of what we call facilitated practice calls or a facilitated practice phase where we connect with folks who have been trained and really support them in using the tool and making it their own. And this is an example of a reflection tool that they fill out as they use the FAN in their work with mentors. And as in our analysis of this data, what we're seeing is that folks are reporting increased confidence and self-awareness as they use the tool and practice it, and also increased engagement with the tool over time. So as they make it their own and practice it, they report liking it better and using it more and finding it really helpful in their work. Okay, so this has been really exciting, working with agencies and staff and mentors to a certain degree, and really working to develop their skills. But as we've tried to measure what we're doing and how it's impacting relationships and skills, we've really been struck by how important it is to be able to measure attunement directly. The measures that we have been using sort of approximate some of these areas like mindfulness, empathy, interpersonal reactivity, self-reflection, but don't get at attunement as a larger construct. And so my work with Kelsey Dean at the University of Auckland has really involved trying to advance the concept of attunement to developing a scale that researchers and program developers and program staff can use to measure attunement even prior to the match and also within relationships across the mentoring system. Okay, so this development of the scale has, initially we revisited the original definition and really tried to incorporate what we've learned about attunement as we've trained and kind of further built out this concept. And through that process, we identified 4 key domains that reflect the definition and the tool itself that we really focused on in developing the scale. And again, time permitting, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about this process. But the key domains that sort of were sort of the initial structure of our scale efforts were self-regulation. So again, the ability to regulate, calm, sort of monitor yourself as an actor in the relationship, reading cues, so this tracking and matching process, flexibility, and collaboration. So how much are you able to take into account the other's needs or the other's interests? So thanks to some collaborations with 2 large mentoring organizations, one called Read Ahead out of New York City and one called Higher Achievement, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C. and also located in other cities. We were able to collect cross-sectional data on mentors, mentor volunteers that were a part of these organizations across 2017 and 2018. And through that process, we tried to conduct essentially we tried to engage in 2 approaches to ensure that the scale was parsimonious and functioned as intended. And I should mention that this was very much in close collaboration with and through the leadership in some cases of other members of the research team, Shannon Milligan and Kelsey Dean. So the first work that we did was conducting a Rosh analysis, and Shannon Milligan led this effort. I won't talk too much about this, but the Rosh analysis pointed us to the importance of reducing the response items. So in other words, initially we had a 7-item scale, and what we found was that really that we only needed 6 items in order to capture the variability that we were seeing. We also noticed that some of the reverse coded items, there were 2 that were initially reverse coded in the original 20-item scale, were problematic in terms of the expected response patterns. But beyond those 2 pieces, the items were generally functioning well, and there wasn't evidence of differential item functioning by gender. Okay, so the second step that we took, and this piece was led by Kelsey, was to conduct a factor analysis to assess the dimensionality of the 2 scales, the generalized and the mentor attunement scale. So these two scales were developed again with 4 attunement subdimensions in mind, those 4 constructs I mentioned. And we were really interested in whether this theorized factor structure was empirically supported, and wanted to make the item as the scale as parsimonious as possible. So we didn't want the subdimensions to inadvertently measure the same thing 4 times. So ideally, also, we wanted the items ideally to be consistent across the generalized and Mentor attunement versions of the scale, so we could essentially measure the same latent construct with different targets. Sorry, one sec, let me just get back to, okay. So the factor analysis process, as I mentioned, was thanks to samples obtained through 2 partnerships, Read Ahead and Higher Achievement. And I'll kind of summarize the process here briefly. We were able to first conduct an exploratory factor analysis on the generalized attunement scale. And just to clarify, that's a scale that asks folks to think about their level of attunement kind of generally across relationships. So we wanted that scale to be able to assess attunement level before someone was matched, in case it could be useful for recruitment or screening. So we initially conducted an exploratory factor analysis of the generalized attunement scale and the Mentor attunement scale to get a sense of whether the factor structure supported the proposed structure of those 4 distinct but related concepts of reading cues, flexibility, collaboration, and flexibility. And through that process, we were able to see, one second here, I'm kind of losing my notes. We were able to then use the exploratory findings to guide a prior specification of the factor structure, which could be tested using confirmatory factor analysis on another independent sample. Because we had, because the Read Ahead mentors completed both the generalized and Mentor attunement scales, we started with the generalized attunement scale and then moved to the Mentor attunement scale. But because we were looking to have a replicable structure across the scales, we really used an iterative process and used the findings from both sets of the analysis to mutually inform the process of scale development. Okay, we can move to the next slide. Okay, so here's the results of the confirmatory factor analysis. The sort of nutshell is that a number of the items were not functioning as intended in terms of the factor structure. And through that process, we were able to sort of identify strong support for a unidimensional 7-item generalized attunement scale that has 3 flexibility, 2 collaboration, and 2 self-regulation items. So what this means is that mentors responded to those 7 items in a similar and patterned way that did not meaningfully distinguish the subscales. So, if a mentor rated themselves highly on encouraging their mentees' ideas, they also tended to rate themselves highly on adapting their approach based on their mentor's preferences, for example. And fortunately, the model was good for the same 7 items of the Mentor attunement scale, and both have good internal consistency and item reliability. Okay, we can move to the next slide. And for those who are interested, these are just some the model fit indices for the 7-item version of the generalized and Mentor attunement scales, and demonstrates a good model fit. Okay, next slide. So these are the 7 items, and again, please don't disseminate this without permission, although we're very eager for folks to start using this. These were the 7 items that now constitute the Mentor attunement scale. The same 7 items constitute the generalized attunement scale, although instead of referring again to the interactions with their mentee, it's just referring to general interactions and relationships with others. Next, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to close here, and certainly we can get to some questions, but just in terms of some initial next steps we're looking to take, we're looking to look across the sample a little bit more closely at things like gender and age. We're also interested in how attunement, the attunement measure sort of overlaps with or diverges from a related empathy scale. We're also we're excited to look at the scale cross-culturally and have some mentor samples we're starting to collect already from India and New Zealand. And we're in the process of engaging, particularly through a project with Kelsey in New Zealand, to observe attunement through visual and audio recordings and kind of look at how observed attunement may be different than self-report attunement, and continuing to develop this construct.
Great, thank you, Julia. And I appreciate not only that you kind of went deep on what this concept of attunement is and why it matters in relationships, but also all the hard work that went into developing a scale to actually measure that, right? And oftentimes we encounter scales when they're already done and you can kind of download them and use them in your program, but there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that it's measuring the right thing, that it's not redundant of other work that's been done. So I really appreciate you kind of pulling back the curtain a little bit and showing how you've been trying to make sure that we're accurately measuring something like attunement when we want to. We do have a couple of quick questions here that I think you can answer. Any thoughts around using something like this or developing a scale for use with students or with the mentees themselves? Obviously, they play a role in having a relationship be attuned, right? So any thoughts about doing this with young people?
Yeah, so that's kind of, I just applied for some relief from the university to try to do just that, because we're looking to try to develop essentially a related scale for the young people in reporting on their mentor and potentially on the staff's attunement level in language that makes sense to a young person, right? So the construct, like this idea of reading cues, how do we adapt that concept in a way that can still stay consistent with what we're trying to understand, but makes sense to a young person? It's been a really interesting process that really is our aim, is to eventually get there and then be able to have programs distribute both. It would be fascinating to look at how consistently mentors and youth are reporting on this construct within the same relationship, and how often those are diverging. My hunch is they're diverging more often than we think. And at the same time, it's been a challenge because it's a challenge, right, for a lot of the reasons that it's hard for us to kind of self-reflect on our own capacities in this area, but also kind of developmentally, how might young people think about this? It might not be as much behavioral as it might be essentially experience. Like the young person might think of it more as, this person understands me, or this person gets at what I'm feeling without me having to say something. That might be a more accurate way to tap into what a young person's experiencing. So it's been a little bit complicated to transfer these constructs to a young person's voice, but we're in the process of doing that. And if anyone is interested in kind of helping us pilot that, please email me, because we'd welcome that partnership.
Sure, thank you. One last quick question here. Someone asked if you could comment on this concept of attunement in relation to trauma or childhood ACEs. Any thoughts around whether this gets harder or whether this can help perhaps in relationships?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a great question. So one of our most fruitful partnerships has been with Friends of the Children here in Chicago, and I think in large part it's because the friends within that mentoring organization are working with young people who are living often in highly stressful circumstances, and we find that calming wedge and the self-regulation component of attunement that we're really working to train becomes particularly important for adults supporting young people who are living in highly stressful environments. So I would say, from my experience and observation and some of this initial work, the concept of attunement is particularly important and challenging in those adult-youth relationships or adult relationships supporting youth, where trauma is involved, or where the environment itself is very under-resourced or exposed to a lot of trauma, particularly because of how challenging it is to kind of, for the young person to regulate their self, and what that then brings to the relationships with adults.
Great, thank you, Julia. We're going to move on to Gabe here. I know folks probably have more questions for you, but we'll make sure that your contact info is in the email that we send out after the event later today, for folks that may want to use that scale in their own work and talk with you more about how to get their hands on that. So thank you, Julia. Okay, so Gabe, you're going to talk with us today about group mentoring and some of the processes that are happening within those dynamic relationships. So take it away, Gabe.
So hi everybody, I'm Gabe Cooper-Mink, and I've got a hard act to follow here, so I hope you stick with me here. And you know, like Julia said, thanks to the National Mentoring Resource Center, to Mike, to Julia. This is it's been a lot of fun to sort of step back and think about this piece. What I'm going to be sharing with you today is some of the work that we've been doing, particularly in a partnership with the San Francisco Unified School District. We've been helping to develop a group mentoring program there and evaluate it. And so later on here, I'll share with you some findings from that study as they relate to these issues that that we're going to be talking about. A couple of things I want to say up front too is at the end of my slides, I've included a whole bunch of resources. Almost all of them are links to websites you can go to and get a lot of background information, actually get the measures and scales that we've been using in our evaluation so if you're interested in pursuing some of this stuff, you can get that there. And just one more thing quickly about the program we've been working with. It's a school-based program that is offered at the 9th grade and it's designed to sort of facilitate adaptation to high school for a group of young people who are entering high school, having been flagged or identified as being at very high risk of dropping out of school. So these are young people who've not done well in middle school. Their grades are fairly low. Their attendance has not been the greatest. And these are young people who are pretty disconnected, who are not feeling a strong sense of connection to school, maybe don't have a lot of friends in the school, et cetera. And so they believed that the school district that a good way of trying to reach those young people was through group mentoring. So that brings us to this first slide here, which to kind of get us all on the same page, I just wanted to start with kind of a definition here of group mentoring. And it's pretty simple, right? There's kids are in groups all the time through school, through all sorts of activities. And mentoring that happens in groups happens in any number of settings where some kind of mentoring activity, I'll talk about what that is in a sec, takes place involving one or more mentors and at least two mentees. And if you look at programs that are out there, ours and many other programs that are there, there's a lot of different configurations in which you see this play out. Probably the three most common are the sort of one-to-many model, where there's one mentor and some number of youth that they are mentoring in a group setting. A second is the team mentoring model, where you'll have two mentors or maybe more than that, and a group of youth. And the program that I've been working with uses that model in particular. It has two co-mentors working with groups of youth, roughly around 6 to 8 youth in a group with two mentors. And then the final one is a hybrid model where it sort of groups together multiple one-to-one mentoring dyads. So you might have, if you're familiar with some of Nancy Deutsch's work or some of Lindsay Weiler's work with mentor families, you might be familiar with those kinds of things. So these are where one-to-one mentoring dyads might come together on some regular schedule and have group activities that they do. So really across all of these different configurations, what needs to happen to make it mentoring and not something else is that there really need to be significant opportunities for meaningful two-way interactions between or among mentors and mentees. So what I'm trying to say here is it's not a class. It's not a place where some adult or some instructor is imparting wisdom on a group of kids. It's something where the kids often have as much to do with determining what happens and how activities play out as the leaders do. That isn't to say it can't have a curriculum. Group mentoring programs typically do have curricula, and that's okay too. You can see the definition can be a little bit on the fuzzy side, but it's one of those know it when you see it things. We can go to the next slide, Mike. So if you look into the research and the literature on group mentoring, there's starting to be a fair amount of that research, but it still lags way behind other forms of research on other forms of mentoring. And when we started really trying to take, get seriously dig into doing research on this, we started going to other areas where group type of work is happening, and really looking to the developmental psychology literature. There's a wonderful paper by Willard Hardup back in 1989 where he talked about the developmental significance of relationships, and really differentiated these sort of two kinds of relationships that really matter as sort of drivers of healthy development for young people. And one kind he called the vertical type involves young people in a relationship with somebody of greater social power. So these are typically, adult, youth, parent, child, teacher, student type of relationships. And he also talked about the importance of horizontal relationships. So these are relationships that involve two or more people of equal social power. So typically we talk about peer relationships. And a big point here was that both of those types of relationships contribute in important ways to learning skills, to kind of driving healthy development. So that's a view from developmental psychology. Another one we looked to was the group psychotherapy literature, and if you're familiar with that, you're probably familiar with Irvin Yalom, who's one of the sort of gurus of group psychotherapy, and he really talked about the therapy group as being kind of a social microcosm, sort of a place that sort of recreates some of the types of social interactions that people encounter in their everyday lives and sometimes struggle with. And so he really wrote about group psychotherapy as being this microcosm and this context for observing relationships in action and for practicing them. He also wrote about them as being places that give members an opportunity both to give and to receive support, and something to belong to, something to feel a part of. And that all of that really rings true to me from having worked with group programs over a number of years, and has been a big part of our thinking in terms of how do we talk about what happens in group relationships. So if you look over to the diagram on the left of the slide and imagine what this experience would look like from the point of view of a young person, one target youth, if you will, in one of these group programs, we can describe the types of interactions and the type of relationships that young person forges with the mentor or the mentors in the group, and that would be described by what's in that sort of segment A of that diagram. That youth also has interactions with other members of the group, so those kind of horizontal interactions that are described by what's happening in the sort of B section of this diagram. And then there's whole group interactions that involve the target youth, the other group members, and the mentors, and that's what's happening in C. And then the section, the segment D there is the types of interactions that this young target youth is able to witness between mentors and other members of the group. So they're not a part of that interaction, but they're able to see how those interactions are going on. And I would add in some of the other configurations, if there's a team of mentors, young people could also witness mentors working together. So mentors working as a team can model positive relationships as well. So you can imagine other types of things going on. And so when we try to capture some of these, we need to be cognizant of all of these different types of relationships and interactions that can happen, and recognize that all of them can be and probably are important to the process and to helping young people learn new skills and so on. So Mike, if you can go to the next one. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and just share a couple of quotes from some of the qualitative work we've done. We've done a lot of interviews and focus groups also with young people and with mentors. One of the nice things about focus groups in this context is that it's a way of sort of mirroring the structure of the groups that are happening. So where in our work we haven't really been able to do direct observation, focus groups have been kind of the closest we could get to it. So when we've spoken to mentors and asked them to tell us, what goes on in the groups, what are some of the things, just from a couple of quotes, you can see how some of these ideas of the types of interactions come out. So mentors talk about how students are getting support not just from an adult, but from each other. So some of that mutual interaction that's going on. And that in our program in particular, which has a goal of helping young people get connected to school, but also improve their grades, mentors sometimes talk about how over the course of the year, the kids start to support one another to improve their grades. So it's not something that's coming just from the mentors, it's also coming from the group as well. Next one, Mike. So we've done similar kinds of work with the mentees, and young people also kind of say some of the same things. So on one hand, they talk about how, talking about the other members of the group, that they talk to each other, they learn about each other and learn things about each other. Talking about mentors, you hear, the similar kind of story you'd hear in other kinds of mentoring programs. They gave us advice, they help us get our grades up and things like that. So you really get a sense just from these, just this very, small taste of some of the qualitative data that we have, that some of those processes are really alive and well. Go on to the next one, Mike. So what that brings us to then is how to think about what mentors' role is. What do they need to be thinking about, and should they be doing? And we've really tried to argue, when I've spoken to a lot of folks who are planning group programs or are doing them, that very often a lot of the rationale for developing or setting up a group program is you don't need as many mentors, you can reach a lot more kids. It's sort of about efficiency. And what I try to impress upon folks and really have some conversation about is that these group programs aren't just about providing guidance and support. It's not just the typical role of a mentor in a one-to-one relationship. There's also this piece of facilitating a group process over a whole life cycle of the group. And what I mean by a life cycle is that, groups typically have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and things look really different at those different stages, if you will, of a group. And I'm thinking of groups that remain intact over a period of time. So for example, in a school-based program, you might initiate the group in September, October, and it keeps going all the way through May of the next year. There can also be groups that have more flexible or fluid membership, where people are coming and going, and that could look a bit different. But when you think about these groups that are intact over a period of time, you may have heard of, you may be familiar with this model of group stages that Tuckman developed that has been used in thinking about work groups and organizational work and psychotherapy groups, and we're using it as well in terms of thinking about mentoring. And Tuckman described these stages as progressing through a period of forming, then storming, norming, and performing. So forming is a stage of trying to get to know each other, figure out what's this all about, why am I here, kind of things. Very naturally, groups from there will move into a storming stage. So this is about kind of figuring out who's in charge, how does this thing work, how do we, who are the leaders, who are the followers, that kind of thing. Over time, that sort of morphs into a norming stage that involves the members of the group trying to figure out what's our task here, how are we going to do this, what are the expectations, and those sorts of things. And then finally, the performing stage is when they get to the point of really doing the task that the group was set up to do. I'll mention also that Tuckman later added a fifth stage, which is adjourning, so the ending point. And if we have some chance in Q&A, I'd be happy to talk a little bit about that as well, but it didn't fit on my diagram, so I didn't include that just here. So what does that mean to facilitate a group process over a life cycle? So in addition to being there to provide guidance and support to individual members, mentors also have the big task of sort of guiding their group through these stages and fostering a positive climate, a positive sense of the group. Also working to keep everybody engaged, right? Because if one or two people sort of take over and take up all the space and do all the talking, you can easily see how others who are quieter or not as assertive might sort of start falling off of it. So that's an important thing. And then finally, promoting positive group norms. In our case, it's about increasing academic performance. Next one, Mike. So when it comes to assessing climate, we looked a lot to the organizational psych literature and some of the psychotherapy literature, and found just as many different models and ideas as there were articles and researchers about it. What we settled on was these three major components that we've really focused on that have to do with cohesion and belonging, a sense of mutual help, and keeping everybody engaged. In a lot of our work, we've developed some simple survey items and have started thinking about a few other facets like teamwork and group social norms. So let me show you what those look like in the next slide. Oh, so some of the types of questions we can address are here, and Mike, you can skip on to the next one. So our measures start with a brief measure to try to tap into that first piece, the relationship that each young person is forming with the mentor. And you can see here, I like meeting. I think my mentor cares about me. They help me to do better. The time we spend together is worthwhile. And then next, we developed a series of questions that try to tap into a sense of cohesion in the group and a sense of belonging. So you can see here items about kids in the group care about each other. When they get mad or upset about each other, they can talk about it in the group. And then, belongingness, I feel like I'm a part of this. And I'll just say these items, that item 5 is about conflict, and that one tends not to load together with the other ones. So 1 through 4 and 6 are our measure of cohesion and belonging. All of these measures have really nice statistical properties. They've worked really well for us. And again, there's a link at the end here where you can go right to it and get a summary of it and more information and actually use this if it's something that you're interested in. Next slide. Here's a set of items that we developed to tap into the idea of mutual help and engagement. So the first 4 items here deal with how you help others deal with problems and how they help you. Items 5, 6, and 7 draw from some theory about engagement in after-school programs, youth development programs, and tap into interest, enjoyment, and concentration as being sort of the glue that sort of creates a sense of engagement. Go on next, Mike. And then I want to end with just sharing a little bit with you about some of our research that's shown how these measures matter. Do they tell us something about the outcomes we're looking for in young people? So we've conceptualized the program, participating in this program is contributing sort of in the short term to what you might call resilience assets. So in this case, they're internal qualities that help young people to, succeed over time. And we found really strong associations between our measure of overall group climate and improvements over time in self-efficacy and self-awareness. You can see that some of the other things, some of the other findings that are grayed out there weren't significant, but had we had a larger sample, they might have reached significance. Go on to the next one, Mike. We also looked at some external resilience assets, which are really kind of the supports, the things out in your environment that can help you to succeed. And what we found here was that our measure of group climate predicted improvements in a sense of being supported at school, a sense that your participation at school is meaningful, and then even that participation at home is meaningful. And what's interesting here is that some of the things that a positive sense of group climate predicted were different than what the relationship with the mentor predicted. So it's really these two things are working in concert with each other. It isn't one or the other, but really both things are happening and both make a difference. Keep going, Mike. The last thing we were interested in was, do these things make a difference for academics? Because after all, our program in particular was focused on helping a group of kids that are struggling in school. And here we found that the relationship with the mentor was really the powerful force here. It was predicting improvements in grades, improvements in the number of credits earned, and by the end of 9th grade and even a year later. But group climate was still playing a role. Group climate was predicting improvements in grades even a whole year after the program was over, which is a really, to me, a very powerful finding, an exciting one. Go on to the next one, Mike. So I could summarize this, but I see we're really short on time, and I'll just end right there. So hopefully we have a little bit of time for questions.
Yeah, no, I think we've got time for one question if someone wants to type one into the question panel here. We did have a question earlier, Gabe, around just the state of tools to measure kind of group relationships like this generally. And it sounds like you had to kind of custom build something for the study in the school district you've been talking about here. Any sense of like kind of the overall quality and availability of tools to measure group things, or did you really have to kind of build something from scratch?
There isn't much, and we sort of built it up from scratch. I've seen people adapt measures of school belonging for this, and just make up simple questions. Again, our measure is available on the National Mentoring Resource Center website. I don't get any money for it, but I think it's worked well for us. We're going to continue to develop it, but really, I haven't seen a whole lot else out there.
Great. Well, thank you, Gabe. I really appreciate you unpacking kind of all the complex dynamics that are happening in a group program like that. And for those of us who are researching those types of programs, really a need to look beyond just mentors' perceptions of the help they're getting from, or youth perceptions of what they're getting from their mentors, but also that group dynamic, right? Do they feel like they're a member of that group? Do they get advice from their peers? Is there conflict with those peers? There's a lot going on in those relationships. So I appreciate you kind of walking us through the many different ways of measuring that, and certainly for making the scale that you developed available to those who joined us today. So as Gabe mentioned, he has a lot of further reading and links to those tools on the slide here. We'll be sending those out later today. Thank you to everyone for joining us for this webinar. The recording slides will be coming to y'all later this afternoon. We're going to be doing another webinar in this series. It'll probably happen in late June or early July. And that one's going to be focusing on research around the intersection of LGBTQ youth and their development and their needs and the work of mentors. So our organization recently came out with a supplement to the Elements of Effective Practice for mentoring LGBTQ youth more effectively. And so my co-author in that, Christian Rummel, will be joining us for a webinar on how folks can study the impact of mentoring for those young people. We're also going to be doing more episodes of the Reflections on Research podcast here, recording them over the summer and releasing them in the fall. And Gabe has already promised that he'll spend a good hour with me unpacking the study that he just talked about in a little bit more detail. So more to come on that. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. And on behalf of OJJDP and the National Mentoring Resource Center, we hope you have a really great day. Thank you.